Morning, everyone. Thanks so much to the organisers for putting together today's panel. I think it's a really important and urgent set of issues which are going to be discussed this morning. So I guess I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some of the kind of police initiatives that we've been seeing in the run-up to the lockdown and the protests that we've seen in recent weeks. And then I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which those protests have been handled, both in terms of the PR and with regards to the police, but also the physical handling of them by the police. And then I want to talk a little bit about the demands being made by a lot of the protesters, both in the United States, but over here as well, and the ways in which there is significant overlap with regards to those demands, and how maybe we can try to drill down and think about what they might mean concretely for criminal justice reform in this country. So the police, I think, in Britain have been involved in three probably quite high-profile initiatives through three, I guess, categories of crime in recent years. I would say that they are those categories of crime are migration, so criminalising people who are migrants, identifying them as undocumented, particularly, of course, through the hostile environment policy, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. The second high-profile one, I would say, is around so-called knife crime or gang crime. Which I guess was a war which was redeclared by David Cameron in 2011 in his so-called all-out war on gangs and gang culture. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And the third is the third category of crime is the war on terror and the use of the prevent agenda and the identifying of terrorists. And so all three of these categories of crime, I think, probably unsurprising to most people today, are implicated by race. Right? So race helps us to understand or identify who the immigrants are, who the gangsters are, and who the terrorists are. And so race plays a really fundamental role in the construction of these categories of crime. But in a practical way, and I think really importantly, there's huge overlap as well in the ways in which the police carry out the policing of suspected gangsters, terrorists, and immigrants. And that's through not just the kind of policing we might be familiar with in previous decades, but a partnership with schools, with hospitals, with places of work, with employers, with housing associations, lots of different areas of life. And I think this is important because it's one of the ways in which an expanded form of policing, which kind of invades many different spheres of public life, has become to be so normalised that when the lockdown took place, the expansion of police powers meant that they were kind of familiar and perhaps a bit more comfortable with policing the private and the public and the working lives of people identified or suspected of breaking lockdown rules, for which black and minority ethnic people were also disproportionately policed. So, as I'm sure everyone's aware as well, we've seen huge protests throughout the world, but including Britain over the last few weeks. And I won't spend a lot of time going into detail about the background to that. I'm sure most people are familiar with the police killing of George Floyd in the United States and the context around that, and the harrowing footage that we're all familiar with. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we have recently seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history, potentially. And over successive weeks, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people from across the country organising anti-racist protests, and not just in big cities like Birmingham or Manchester or London or Bristol, but also in small towns and villages in parts of Wales and Northern England, where people have been organising vigils and other forms of political action in solidarity with what's been taking place in other parts of the country and the world. And I think this is really, really, I think it's difficult to not be inspired and energised by that. And I think the second thing about these protests, which is really positive, is the fact that they've overwhelmingly, particularly in the large cities, been organised by very young people. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of the protesters. I've been helping to provide, legal observers and arrestee support and all of that kind of stuff. And these are young people who look at me as somebody who's old at 33. These are people in their late teens, very early 20s, haven't really organised protests and campaign stuff before. They're kind of learning as they go, and I think it's difficult to again not be inspired by a new generation of anti-racist activists who are so energetic and effective at mobilising large groups of people. So in the first protest that I was doing the legal observing at, I noticed and was very surprised at how hands-off the police had been. Very, very hands-off indeed. A very thin police presence on the ground. It was almost a carnival-y atmosphere. You had some places where people were speaking. You had some Caribbean elders talking about the Windrush scandal. You had people playing music in other parts. You had community groups like London Campaign Against Police and State Violence handing out PPE. Lots of different kind of it was a very festively atmosphere on Parliament Square or Hyde Park, wherever it might have been. And I think it was around the second or third or fourth protest that I think the patience of the police began to dwindle, and we began to see the kind of policing which we might be more familiar with at large protests, particularly protests where there are significant numbers of young black people. So we saw riot police being used, we saw horses being used, we saw the tactic of kettle and mass arrest being deployed as well. And of course, alongside that, we saw the kind of stories and narratives that we're familiar with. So the idea that riot police, obviously heavily armoured with batons, flanked by officers on horses, charging, of course, at unarmed civilian protesters, was a response to some kind of violence. It's not a violence that I was aware of or saw, or any of our legal observers saw, but it was a narrative which the press picked up and parroted quite quickly. And I think what was perhaps most disturbing about this was, of course, the incident that caught most of the headlines, which was one police officer charging so virulently that they knocked themselves off of their horse. The first story which the press picked up on was that protesters dragged the police officer off their horse, which they then had to, of course, do a U-turn of once some camera phone footage emerged of the officer knocking themselves off the horse by riding into a traffic light. But I think what's also really important about this is that once the horse kind of broke free, it trampled on a young black girl, and this young black girl nearly died. She nearly lost her life because of this, and we've barely heard anything from her at all. I think there was one interview with her on ITV News. The BBC has barely mentioned it at all, and in the interview on ITV News she said that she had to call the police didn't help her. She had to call the police to try to make a complaint. She's obviously, of course, badly bruised and very shook up. Her mobile phone was smashed to pieces, and she said that the response of the police was, well, if you're so concerned about your mobile phone, why don't you ask your people to pay for it? And so we're seeing here this, I think, a very different kind of attitude from the police, making their kind of being quite clever with the PR and arguing that these mainly often young black protests are being violent, and therefore this charging of police forces is something which is necessary. But also, I think, quite an intimidating approach through the kettling and the mass arrests, taking people's photographs, forcing them to compelling them to give their information to them, and again having this very dismissive attitude to this example of excessive use of force. But the police have been doing other things as well in relation to this. They've been using what are called gang injunctions. So gang injunctions are maybe a bit like ASBOs for those who are unfamiliar with them, or they might be similar to the control orders used in the prevent agenda, which prevent young people who don't necessarily have a criminal record or a criminal or a violent history, but for one reason or another have been put onto the police's gangs database, and it can prevent them from seeing specific people, going to specific places, using social media, a number of different kinds of injunctions. And what the police have been doing recently is identifying people that they say are not allowed to go to Black Lives Matter protests. Two quite high-profile ones are actually well-known rappers, Dutchavelli and Digger. Very well-known, successful rappers at the moment who have been identified by the police and contacted because they've put Black Lives Matter pictures on their social media. And the police have said if you attend any Black Lives Matter protests, that will be in breach of your injunction. And the way they're doing that is linking the Black Lives Matter protests to violence, and they're saying that they're going there to engage in violence. So we're seeing the ways in which this policing of gangs and, by extension, particularly young black people, is being used not only to control their kind of private lives, but also to impede on their political freedoms as well of protest. Okay, so finally, I think I'm talking a little bit about, very briefly, just a little bit about some of the arguments that are being made and demands that are being made. Anyone reading the press would think that the main demand of these protesters is to remove some statues, and that really hasn't been the case at all. Most of the demands have been around criminal justice reform, and of course, on the more radical end, it's been about what we might call defunding of the police, or and this is premised on the idea that we can't solve our social problems through increasing the power of the police and prison system. And so therefore it's a demand of ending this war on gangs, ending the war on terror, ending the hostile environment policy, and rather investing in the community institutions, the youth clubs, mental health provision, particularly for young people, that can help the most vulnerable people in our society before they come into contact with the criminal justice system. And maybe we'll have a bit more time to talk about that later, but I think this is again a really inspiring and important thing coming out of this current wave of protest.